Well, welcome back, everybody. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, once again from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. And that, of course, means another segment of Smart Talk Radio is in your future. And this one, a very, very interesting one indeed. We're going to be talking about the royal family's 1,000-year curse, the murder or attempted murder of every king and queen, and a fascinating work called Assassination. Our guest this segment is David Maislish. He is an attorney and partner at the global law firm Duane Morris. He lives in London, married with 5 kids, which is probably a work in and of itself. But this should be a fascinating interview indeed. David, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine. Good morning.
Well, we are excited to have you here. We have certainly never covered this subject. First of all, let's do a little setup for our Lewis at Large listeners. Why the subject of the assassination or the assassination attempts of royalty there, why is that a fascination to you?
Well, I wanted to write a book about English history, and I wanted something with a bit of action. So I decided to write about the 11 kings and queens who had been killed. And then I thought maybe I could enlarge it a little and look at the other monarchs. We've had 45 of them, and see whether there was an angle that I could show that maybe some more were killed. And I managed to more than double the number, and find another 12 who almost certainly or very likely were killed, and all the information is in the book. And now I'm at 23 out of 45 who are killed, and now I start looking at the others, the other 22. And believe it or not, the other 22, although they weren't killed, it was only a matter of luck, because they all had an assassination attempt. It's just that 23 of them were successful attempts, and the others got away with it. So there were just half of our kings and queens were lucky, and half were unlucky. But someone had to go at every single one of them, sometimes several times.
Yeah, that is revealing. I'm not as erudite and as bright as our listeners are. I'm not sure they're aware that half of the royalty were murdered. Was that a surprise to you?
Extraordinary, yes. It was what I was looking to try to prove, but I wasn't really very optimistic, but it just worked out to be true.
Where it is, and let's cover this quickly, or as in much depth as you want. Let's talk about Lady Di. Where does she fall in all this?
Well, she doesn't really come into this because she wasn't a king or a queen.
Correct.
So, I mean, if I had started going into the wives of and the husbands of kings and queens and those near their children and everything, the book would be about 10,000 pages long. So I had to restrict myself just to the theory that I can prove that someone tried to kill every single king and queen, and I can write a book, which is what I've tried to do, which is not a boring old history book telling you about crops and agriculture and international relations and the Industrial Revolution. I can leave that aside. I can write 45 murder stories or attempted murder stories and wrap the history around those murder stories. So for each reign, you've got 10 pages with plenty of photographs and family trees and whatever. And it's central to it is the murder, the thriller. And around the thriller, the context allows you to learn the history incidentally at the same time without being bored to death by it.
Well, I would think that these assassinations fall into maybe one of 3 categories. 1, someone deranged. 2, someone hated or group hated the particular person in the royal family. Or 3, they were just targeting the royal family for just the fact that they were a royal family. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, you're right. At the beginning, in the early days, you couldn't divide it in time periods exactly, but more or less in early days, it's someone else who wanted the crown. Then later on, it developed into battles where a foreign country would try to kill the English king because that's a better chance of winning the battle if the other side has lost its leader. Later on, it developed into rival families in England trying to take over power. Then it moved on to lunatics, as you rightly say, just mad people. And finally, it ended up with people, not so much who didn't like the royal family, but people who didn't like the English and thought, well, the best way of expressing themselves, their hatred, would be to kill the monarch. Although, of course, in the last couple of 100 years, it doesn't do anything. There's someone waiting to step straight in the next day, and nothing happens in politics or government of the country that changes.
What percentage of those that were successful, and let's also toss in those that were not, did any of them get away with it, or were they all ultimately identified?
In recent times, in the last 300 years, they've all been identified and either locked up in an asylum or else executed. But in earlier times, when it was a rival monarch, they were successful. They took, not only did they get away with it, but they took the crown themselves. And you can get a very early one in William the Conqueror, who came over from Normandy and conquered England. He was succeeded by his son, William II, and he had a younger brother who rather fancied the idea of being king himself. So he arranged one day when his brother was out hunting, not to do anything himself, because then as a murderer the church wouldn't allow him to be crowned, but he got a very friendly family, the Clares, to arrange it, and they just had him shot while he was hunting, shot with an arrow, and he was killed, and Henry, the younger brother, just took over, no problem at all. And the extraordinary thing is that when you trace about these things, this Clare family, there were basically three brothers, and one of them, his 19th great-grandson, was George Washington.
Well, that is, you've done your research for sure. Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, and our guest this segment, David Maislish, the work is Assassination, the royal family's 1,000-year curse, the murder or attempted murder of every single king and queen, indeed. David, as you were doing the research here, were you surprised that the royal families knew that assassination attempts would be coming? What kind of protection were they afforded, and has that protection increased over the years?
It's increased, but you can never be 100% safe. I mean, once you go out of your home, or even if you're in your home sometimes, if it's big enough full of people, there's always an opportunity. So they never have been safe, and nobody is immune. Everybody can be killed if given the right chance, and also if it's someone who's a lunatic who doesn't mind being caught. They're willing to have a go. Maybe they'll succeed, maybe not. It's worth a chance. And once you get someone like that, it's pretty dangerous. So they know it all, and they're well protected. But against lunatics, it's difficult.
What about those that wore the crown that were the victims, maybe of numerous unsuccessful attempts? Were there particular kings and queens that were targets all the time?
Well, Queen Victoria was quite extraordinary. She had, I think, a total of 8 attempts against her. One of them had a little success, maybe not a real killing attempt. A fellow just beat her about the head with a stick before no one ever found out why he did it. But also she had several attempts of people shooting at her as she was going by in her carriage with a pistol. But, it's not like in those days, like you see in the films with Clint Eastwood. He sees someone 200 yards away, takes out a pistol and shoots him between the eyes. In those days, pistols were not that accurate. If you're over about 20 yards away, you got little chance. So not only did they not kill Victoria, they didn't even injure her. They just missed her completely, but didn't stop them from trying. And so 8 unsuccessful attempts is quite a lot.
David, we don't have time to examine every one, obviously, but let's talk, share with our listeners specifically the story of Jane Grey in 1553. Well,
Jane Grey, we had Henry VIII. He was very keen to create a great Tudor dynasty, and he was desperate to have a son, which is the main reason he kept executing and divorcing his wives. And when he did have a son, he was really very poorly. His mother died in childbirth, and the boy was a sickly boy. And although he became king as Edward VI, he didn't have long to live. And so he had some senior courtiers take over. And this was a time when Catholics and Protestants started fighting amongst each other. And this Edward VI was a very, very strong, strident Protestant and persecuting the Catholics. And his minister pushed him, senior minister pushed him all the way. And when the boy was dying, given a lot of drugs which were probably poisonous, which probably poisoned him in the end, all his hair fell out, his nails fell out, he was coughing blood all the time, he finally was put away. And the senior minister knew that he was in trouble, because next in line was Edward's sister, Mary, and she was a very strong Catholic. So she was going to have a go at all the Protestants who had been persecuting the Catholics. So the minister needed to find someone who was Protestant to be the next monarch. And so he found Edward's, rather than his sister, he found his second cousin, which was Jane Grey. And then he arranged, this minister, for his son to marry Jane Grey, so he'd be king. And he had Jane Grey announced or proclaimed as queen, but the people knew it was a set-up, and 9 days later she was dethroned and imprisoned, and in the end Mary, the next queen, cut her head off.
And again,
so 9 days, not very much.
Why imprisoned?
Well, because she had to be put away because she'd usurped the rightful queen,
right.
And it was still a threat. And now that Mary was in charge, as a Catholic, she was going to persecute the Protestants, and they would need a hero or heroine to lead them. So Jane Grey would be the proper person, and so she had to be locked up. There was a rebellion. There was a rebellion led partly by Jane Grey's father, and he was executed. But once her father was executed, it was time to execute her as well.
There are kings and queens in world history around the world. Why are the assassination attempts? Are they greater? Were they greater in England, or were they typical of what was going on around the world?
They were typical, but of course, not many countries have had so many kings and queens. The monarchies, even the ones like nowadays in Belgium and Holland, I don't know what number they're on. They're only about on their 12th or their 15th monarch or something. And those which had started in other countries many, many years ago, such as in Russia and in France, and in German states, they've all gone. So England's the only one which started at the beginning and is still continuing with such great numbers. So we've had 45. I don't think anybody of the major states has had more than about 20, 25. So they can't tell the same story.
David, we would be remiss, obviously, if we didn't talk about the assassination or assassination attempts on the current Queen Elizabeth. Share a story about that.
There are three, although probably only really two. One of them was a guy, so he's in his late teens. He decided to shoot the Queen when she was inspecting the troops in London, and she was riding by, and in those days she did it on horseback. And he tried to get ammunition for a gun, but he couldn't buy the ammunition, so he only bought blanks. So he shot at her 5 times, but for what reason one doesn't know, because he didn't have live ammunition in, but all he was screaming at the end was he wanted to be famous. So he was put in a psychiatric home and let out after a number of years with a different identity. And I can write a little bit about him because I was telling the story to my wife's sister over dinner, and she said, "My God, I know him. He was in my class at school. I can tell you all about him." So there's some amazing. So there's some, first-hand information in the book about him. But that wasn't real because he was using blanks. But then when she was in Australia on a tour, on a train, some group, one doesn't know whether they were Irish or anti-monarchist or whatever, they put a log across the tracks so that the train would topple off and kill everyone. But fortunately, the train was going very, very slowly because the driver didn't want to arrive too early before the band was playing and everything,
right,
and everyone was assembled. So he was going at a really snail's pace. And therefore, when they hit the log, the train just continued with the log trapped under its wheels. Then a couple of years later, she was on tour, this time in New Zealand, and she was doing a walkabout in a town called Dunedin, And some guy who's still at school, a teenager, he was a very angry guy, and he decided that he was going to shoot her. He stole a rifle, wrapped it up in a pair of old jeans, and went and stood in the best place to watch the Queen on her walkabout. But the trouble of standing in the best place is that someone else will want to stand there as well. And two policemen, unfortunately, decided this would be a good place for them to stand and watch the Queen. And so they came and stood beside him, so he was trapped, so he just ran out into the street, raised the rifle, and shot in the direction of the Queen, but either he missed or else he was out of range, but he didn't hit her, but he was later arrested and put in prison, and in the end he was let out, and then he was imprisoned again, and then he took the lead from the television in his cell, wrapped his head in a towel, wet towel, and stuck the electricity lead somehow on his head and killed himself.
Wow, this almost sounds like a made-for-TV movie you're talking about.
quite a long one.
we touched on briefly, and again, we're talking about the work Assassination with David Maislish and the royal family's 1,000-year curse. David, who is responsible for protecting the royal family? Is that MI6 or is that Scotland Yard? Who would be our Secret Service there?
It's a part of Scotland Yard. It's the Royal Protection Division. So they're there with them all the time. So that's their job. MI6 and MI5, they're basically intelligence, spies, and counter-espionage.
Is there a particular story of all the research that you've done that you found either the most fascinating, the most interesting, the most bizarre? Pick one out that really intrigued you?
Well, I like the one about, the word like is perhaps not right, but I was interested in the one about the Queen's grandfather, George V, because when I got down to him, I was stuck, and I was going to have to change the title or the subtitle of the book to the murder or attempted murder of all except one of the English monarchs, which wouldn't have been very good. And then the diary of his doctor was published. And in the diary, the doctor explained what happened when the king died. And what happened was, the king was in a bad way, and the doctor decided that he was going to die with a bronchitis, pneumonia, something like that. But it was late in the evening, and he wasn't sure if he was going to die this day, the next day, whenever. Now, if he died right now in the evening, then the news would be in the Times, which is the English, like the New York Times, the establishment, most correct, appropriate newspaper for serious news. If, on the other hand, the king survived a few hours and died in the morning, the news would be published in an evening paper, or as the doctor called it, an evening journal. He didn't like to give them the title of newspaper. And that was just unacceptable that a rag like that could have the first news of the king's death. So he phoned his wife, the doctor, and told his wife to phone the editor of the Times and told him to hold the print run. Then he took out a hypodermic, filled it with poison, and stuck it in the king's neck. Then he phoned his wife and said, "You can phone the Times and tell them they can print that the king has died. A peaceful departure," I think is what they printed. But I know some people say, all he was doing was bringing the death forward a bit. But, that's what murder is, bringing death forward a bit. It's only a question of how much forward. Also, people say, well, it's euthanasia, but it's not. Because euthanasia is when you're terminating someone because they've been in terrible pain or they're in a vegetative state and there's no hope. This guy never even discussed it with the family, and he certainly didn't get the king's approval, because we know for sure what the king's last words were, and they were to the nurse who handed the hypodermic to the doctor, and his last words to her were, "God damn you." So he wasn't too pleased about what was coming either. So that was quite a new story.
I'm curious as to the reaction, and again, I know the book is recently published, but the kind of reaction you've got either from royal family, the press, and also any law enforcement of any kind over there? What kind of reaction are you getting to the book?
No, none at all. None at all from law enforcement or the royal family. I don't know if they've read it. The Queen's got a copy. I sent it to her, and I got a very formal letter back thanking me for my kindness. I did tell her that, as far as she was concerned, there was a happy ending if she got as far as page 482. But people have just been intrigued by it and have enjoyed it as a good read rather than tremendous revelation, because the book is also full of a lot of what I would call anecdotes, things that, aside from the royal history, the origin of the cappuccino, the origin of the croissant, of Chardonnay wine, of the passport, of drinking chocolate, all these things are connected with one of the English kings or queens, and just an amazing story to read that. Something that you can go out for a meal with friends and say, did you know that? Without getting involved in all the history. It's just a series of anecdotes and stories which kept the book alive.
Is there anything, as we begin to kind of wind down here, what is, and again, not what's the lesson from the book, but now that you've done all this research, fascinating stories, each and every one of them, what's sort of the headline? Is there a lesson to be learned out of all of this?
Well, the lesson for the English history is that as many people as they killed, the same group of families, as you see from all the family trees, kept in power for over 1,000 years. It's all the same people. The other thing, really, for general use, is that the more you look, the more you find. And the more you read, the more research, the more and more information comes out, amazing information. And it just never stops, And you can work out amazing things throughout the book when someone has been killed or someone has had the crown taken away from them. I go into investigating who would now be queen or king if that person had not had a child, had not been thrown out because he was the wrong religion or whatever. And you can find people in Germany and in Australia and goodness knows where, who in those circumstances would now be our king or queen. Several of them walking around today, but for a trick of history would be the monarch. Any
reason to think at all that future monarchs will avoid this fate?
Well, the subtitle is The Royal Family's 1,000-Year Curse. So it's a finite 1,000-year period, and when you get to the book, you'll find out when it began and when it ends or has ended or will end. But at some stage it ends, because it's 1,000 years. So maybe they're okay, or maybe they will soon be okay. You'll have to read the book to find out.
The book, again, is Assassination, the Royal Family's 1,000-Year Curse by David Maislish. It's a fascinating work indeed. David probably can guess, but how can people get a copy of the work?
Well, you can get it in bookshops, or you can order it from the bookshops. So if you Google my name or Google Assassination, you'll get it. You can get it on Amazon. I think the book costs itself in the States about $15.99. If you want to download it on Amazon onto your Kindle or tablet or whatever, it's $2.99. It's not a big risk payment. So it's quite easy to get hold of, either hard copy $15.99 or download $2.99.
Well, I do appreciate you spending time with us today. Fascinating subject, and on behalf of my London-born and bred mother-in-law, thank you. She will be extremely pleased reading this, I'm sure. And what's any plans for another work from you?
Yes, I'm going to do another work which I'm just starting on, but this time it's on the American War of Independence. I need to learn something new.
Okay. Hey, listen, again, thank you so much, and we'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.